U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered a fierce speech against China last week. Although he chose to address at the Nixon birthplace and library, some analysts are saying Pompeo doesn't understand about China, Richard Nixon, and the U.S. foreign policy. Calling 50 years of U.S. policy on China failed, Pompeo urges to induce China to change in more creative and assertive ways. What is the Trump administration doing by spreading such words demonizing the Communist Party of China, and what's the potential impact on the two sides and the rest of the world? Joining me for the discussion from Beijing is Zhao, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and from Philadelphia, Blackburn, Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies, a consultancy. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. But first, let's take a quick look at what was being said last Thursday. In the speech entitled Communist China and the Free World's Future, Mike Pompeo concluded that after 50 years of blind engagement with China, U.S. policy has failed because China did not evolve into a democracy, he said. He said we must admit a hard truth that should guide us in the years and decades to come, that if we want to have a free 21st century, the old paradigm of blind engagement with China simply won't get it done. We must not continue it, and we must not return to it. The kind of engagement we have been pursuing has not brought the kind of change inside of China that President Nixon had hoped to induce. In reaction, Richard Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, who previously served as Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. State Department from 2001 to 2003, published an article in the Washington Post on Pompeo's speech, saying Mike Pompeo doesn't understand about China, Nixon, and U.S. foreign policy because it is not within our power to determine China's future, much less transform it. What the United States can and should try to do is shape China's choices to bring about a China that acts with a degree of restraint at home and abroad, and that works with us to deal with regional challenges. So, Zhao, let me go to you first. First of all, what do you think is the central premise, the central idea that Pompeo wants to spread by giving that speech, and what do you think of that central idea?
Well, the central idea, I think, in Pompeo's speech is that he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And therefore, all his recommendations, his view of history, of reality, and of American policy towards China is evolved around this very central issue. And therefore, he wanted to deny that the historical relationship between the two countries are mutually beneficial. And he denied that in reality, Americans launch a lot of attacks. Instead, the Chinese part is the aggressive part. And also, he said that in the future, he wanted to build alliance against China in the world, pushing other allies and partners of the United States to turn against China because of ideological and Western value. So I think overall, because his misjudgment about history and reality, and he based on this American foreign policy on the wrong premises, that to overthrow Chinese Communist Party or to contain China again using Cold War tactics will succeed is completely wrong. So I think in that respect, Haas just pointed out the right symptom, but at the source of it is still a very much religious-like zealous against the Chinese Communist Party and a very much ideological perspective on China.
Let's remind people that this address was carefully chosen to be given in front of the Nixon Library, and there were several Nixons among the audience who clearly applauded what Pompeo was talking about, and yet Mr. Haas suggested that Pompeo didn't understand what Nixon was trying to do. So, Brandon, what is your take on the choice of this place and whether Pompeo understood exactly why or what prompted America to start engaging with China in the 1970s?
Well, in terms of the location, this was very carefully orchestrated. Over the last month, we've seen 4 high-ranking members of the Trump administration: Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor; FBI Director Chris Wray; Attorney General William Barr, who spoke at the Ford Museum, President Ford, to also be able to draw allusion to the initial engagement with China; and now finally Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, all speaking about different aspects of the relationship with China. These 4 speeches are designed specifically to be read together as a package. This is what I would like to call the Pompeo doctrine related to China. It's also, weirdly, one of the most coherent policies the Trump administration has put out about foreign policy since before he became president, which to me says this doesn't actually come from President Trump, an incoherent leader led by whims of Twitter fandoms and fiefdoms and angry outrages, and this is more about Secretary Mike Pompeo writing his own narrative about today and the future. And it is politically craven, driven by engaging with a dispute about China to strengthen his own position as conservatives try to paint China as the Cold War Part 2. And the speech is specifically designed to create an idea that not only has America failed over the last 50 years, not only are the new ideas being put forward by William Barr and Mike Pompeo brand new and groundbreaking, which is always exciting for voters to get behind, but it then sort of twists a whole lot of facts, from misunderstanding Nixon to misunderstanding the last 10 years of engagement to blatantly lying about different actions of the Obama administration, into a world where Mike Pompeo and his supporters, who I believe are preparing Pompeo for a 2024 presidential run in a post-Trump world, want the world to see him as the only path forward on a major national issue.
So exactly what was the purpose of that prompted President Nixon to visit China back in 1972? Because he said famously that he came because of the interest of America. Did he come to change China, or did he come for something else? Brandon, still with you.
He came specifically to try to find a way to create space between China and the then Soviet Union. That was his entire goal. His entire goal was to create a way to open China up to the West enough politically on the international scheme to weaken the Soviet Union. It was not about transforming China internally. It was about changing the world order and weakening the Soviet Union. Even in the years after opening up, Nixon applauded the change that China made as engaging the rest of the world, joining the world order, and things that we see culminating in the 90s with joining the World Trade Organization, which I would say was a success and an example of continued success of engaging China in the larger world order, and we saw it as helping something that would weaken the Soviet Union, leading to its eventual collapse. This was never about expressly changing internally. Now, many experts in the United States hoped and believed, particularly in the height of the 90s economic booms, that there would be greater changes within China, but it was never the express policy of the United States government, nor specifically the Nixon administration.
Zhao, what is your understanding of the situation, especially from China's understanding when Nixon came to China, when China started diplomatic relations with the United States? What was China's belief? Was there ever this secret wish that China would trick the United States into helping China to grow? Meanwhile, when China is strong, China would replace or, you know, erase the United States from the earth, from the surface of the earth.
Well, you know, Richard Nixon is very famous for, he's a Cold Warrior. On that point, I think Mr. Pompeo was right. But in terms of getting to China, that is definitely not his first goal, probably at the end of his list. Let me be very clear. Nixon came to China to end the Vietnam War, and also trying to you know, get together with China and put pressure on the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union would negotiate with the United States for its strategic weapons. So I think at the end of the day, the United States reached both goals. One is that the U.S. finally pulled out from the Vietnam and get out of that quagmire actually caused, that led to chaotic situation in the United States, very much like today. And also, secondly, the United States actually pressured the Soviet Union. Ultimately, they both signed the treaty between the two sides, in which today the United States wants to get out of. So overall, I think China actually contributed to the end of the Cold War, and both sides wanted to build a world with peace and prosperity, and that has gradually become true in the 1990s and 2000s. So that's why, from the very beginning, Pompeo had the wrong interpretation of the positive side of U.S.-China relationship, and he put a very negative picture on this bilateral relationship.
Yeah, I wonder, is this a misunderstanding? Is this just a problem of ignorance, or was it deliberate twisting of history so that he can build the narrative of a very demonized, very evil Communist Party of China to pave the way for what Brandon was talking about, his own political ambition, possibly a 2024 presidential candidacy, Zhao?
I think he has two aims. First of all is, of course, for the short term, he wanted to use China as a scapegoat to shift blames towards China, particularly for the COVID-19 and for the current situation in the United States. That's for sure. But for the long run, I think he wanted to paint Chinese Communist Party as some sort of evil empire that is trying to spread out of China and trying to invade or influence other countries, particularly democracies, domestic politics, and also from that twist or misrepresentation of China's intentions domestically and globally, he can basically fabricate a lot of accusations against China, find some sort of that. You know, the close of Houston consulate is one of that case in which he can put a label on China for stealing IP or for cyber theft or for any other reason or any other excuse for the United States to take extreme measures. So I think overall, this whole speech is prepare for more actions against China, laying down the basis for the Cold War 2.0.
Brendan, what is your take? And also, it's very bothering because now they openly talk about induced change. You know, basically that means America wants China to experience a regime change, while, according to the latest survey, 95% of Chinese people are satisfied with the job of the Chinese government. And it is the policy, the principle of the United States back in 1941 when they signed the Atlantic Charter, that they believe countries have the right to decide what kind of political political system they adopt. So what is going on to publicly elaborate the desire and to call for more creative and assertive ways to bring about change in a sovereign, independent country? What's going on here?
Well, first of all, this is why the argument from Pompeo and his colleagues is so insidious. Because there is a fundamental truth at the core of his argument, and here's what it is. China is not the same country it was 10 years ago. The leadership of Xi Jinping and the current Chinese government is different. They are approaching the world differently. That is natural as the country has grown in economic power and political power and its role in the world. And the United States does need to rethink its strategy in the long term with China, not necessarily as negatively as Mike Pompeo was saying, but we do need to rethink it. And this is why it's insidious. Because many scholars are starting to recognize, look, what we believed in the 90s probably isn't true anymore. Frankly, what we believed in 2005 about China, probably not true anymore. We need to rethink this. So Mike Pompeo is taking that moment and he's running to the extreme hardcore far right and saying, well, we need to rethink this and we need to treat them like the Soviets we did in the 1960s and 70s, and we need to have regime change. Language the United States has not engaged in on this level in decades. They're talking about a global power struggle that I believe Mike Pompeo and the conservatives of the Trump administration that are hoping to survive the Trump administration's eventual downfall can rally conservatives around this patriotic belief that all the problems in the United States aren't about the conservative party, aren't about President Trump, aren't about any of our own issues, but are all at the fault of China. And that fault must be confronted in a global struggle for power. That is very dangerous language. It's very concerning about the near term and the long term solutions around the world for many of the problems confronting us, from human rights to environment to actual economic development to just human safety. We are dealing with people who are irresponsibly going to extreme language to harm world order.
And this is unbelievable because you are not talking about a small country where the population is rather small, where it is easy that you go and topple the existing government and try to, you know, instill someone that's convenient for you. We're talking about China, 1.4 billion people, and then you're talking about regime change. That's clearly against the fundamental principles of the international order, which is respect of sovereignty, respect of each other's internal affairs, you know. And now we have the Secretary of State of the founder of the international order that we're living in, talking openly about regime change in another independent country. However you don't like the system, however much the problem could be very, very grave, is that the approach to deal with another country that is an equal member of the international community, Zhao? I'm totally speechless here.
Well, because let's say just for the sake of this talk, we say it's Pompeo's doctrine. Let's say it. So the Pompeo doctrine is not about fighting against 1.4 billion Chinese people, because that policy has failed. It tried and failed, because if the United States wants to confront China as a country, as a nation, it cannot do that unilaterally, and therefore he changed his tactic by two fronts. On the number one, he wanted to isolate the Chinese Communist Party and also the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and separate them from the general population and say the Chinese people somehow is on the U.S. side and they can unite, try to provoke or incite these people against the party. And secondly, they want to have a global sort of alliance against China.
Right.
Therefore, U.S. is not working alone, but having partners working with them.
Well, we're going to talk about that in the second half of this show. We have to leave it here with the Zhao and Brandon Blackburn Dwyer. Thank you so much for having joined us. And you are watching The Point. We'll be right back with more on this very important topic. Stay with us. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point. Welcome back. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, and in Beijing via Skype, Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics. So I want to go straight to Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor's recent speech, where he said, how do we fail to understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party? The answer is simple, because we did not pay heed to the CCP's ideology. By the way, the official name of the Chinese Communist Party is the Communist Party of China, so CPC. If you want to talk about something, get the name right. But my question really is, Rick, the Republican Party traditionally have not been famous for being very ideological, and yet what we're seeing here is ideology, ideology, ideology. They even talk about Marxism, Leninism, and I don't really know whether they understand exactly what they're talking about. But so why now? What has happened?
Well, I think you have Mike Pompeo stepping into a void here and creating a doctrine out of sort of random thoughts that come out of the Twitter handle of Donald Trump. He is, I think, the strongest U.S. Secretary of State since the 1950s with John Foster Dulles in terms of seeing godless communism as the threat to the world order. And we're hearing more about Marxist-Leninism than we've heard, I think, in 60 years. It's very interesting to me. I do believe that Mike Pompeo is taking advantage of this year to create a doctrine that's similar to Winston Churchill in 1946 with the famous Iron Curtain speech in Missouri. And the line that I think stood out to me in the speech of Pompeo at the Nixon Library was that he wants to create common lines in the sand that can't be washed away. He wants this worldwide anti-China effort to go beyond the Trump administration. Winston Churchill was out of power when he gave the famous speech that resonates even today. And I think Pompeo actually has said something that is coherent, whether you agree with him or disagree with him.
So, so would you call this the new Iron Curtain speech? Do you think this speech will really be remembered as such, or signaling a real nascent intention from the part of the United States to launch a new Cold War? Because Pompeo didn't mention the word Cold War there. Rick?
Right. I do not believe that this represents anything necessarily of the United States as a whole. It does of the Trump administration beyond the president. I think that he created different terms instead of the new Cold War. He talked about Chinese attempts at hegemony. He quoted Richard Nixon, or sort of twisted something Richard Nixon said about creating a Frankenstein, meaning the Frankenstein monster. So I do think he wants to create something's lasting. Right, and distrust and verify echoes of Ronald Reagan, but in a dystopian way. Reagan was the optimist, trust but verify. The Trump doctrine is dystopian. It is distrust but verify.
Yeah, Professor Liu Baocheng, what do you make of all of this? What is the significance or the insignificance or the lack thereof about the speech?
Well, I think now, given the reality the United States is facing politically, and also given the global tension going on, and politicians with very weird ambitions can really take a huge advantage, at least to their perspective, to hijack people's attention and also to manipulate people's ideology, and that's what Pompeo is doing. And now, behind his speech, it reflects two very important aspects. One is really the divide between the politics in the United States as how to view their position to the world and how to view their relationship with China. And it also reflects that a general sentiment in the United States that is growing negatively towards the China-U.S. relationship, which is a very unfortunate situation. I shouldn't say that China is totally perfect, but but China is moving ahead despite of its recent years of assertive posture. And China has no intention of disrupting the global order. And now, with some rhetorics, with the selective attention and even myopic, say, bias, and politicians are taking advantage of that, either to inflate their importance in the particular historical moment, or to achieve their ego by receiving more attention with voters.
Basically,
so this is the situation.
Yeah, basically, the more hostile, the more twisted the U.S. rhetoric is about China, the more they're pushing the Chinese people behind the the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government. And one of the things that this administration had been doing, especially recently, is to drive a wedge to separate the Communist Party of China, the CPC, with the Chinese people. Rick, how do you look at such efforts? Some people are calling this the identity politics that the U.S. is trying to play with here. What do you think of this, and what's the potential harm or damage of that?
Well, I think we have to analyze it on two levels. One is that Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration definitely are trying to separate the Chinese people from the Communist Party. In his speech, Pompeo talked about the Chinese Communist Party and its regime, meaning the Chinese government, as opposed to the government of China. He talked about Xi Jinping using his Communist Party title and not using his government title. So it's clear he's trying to do what he can to drive the wedge. But I think a bigger wedge that he's trying to drive is between what he called the, quote, free world and China. He talked about, instead of the old Cold War language of free world and the communist world, it was the free world and the Chinese world. And he painted a vision of what the Chinese world would look like. Yeah. And so I think that a lot of what he's doing is not to change China, but it's to change views in Europe, change views in Africa and Pakistan, around Asia, right, of the role of China in the world. Basically, it's trying to tell the world how to react to China. Let's not forget, it sounds very familiar, during the Cold War, during the trade war 2018, the U.S. were also talking about a trade coalition of the willing, and at this moment, I've yet to see such a thing forming. So, Professor Liu, how do you look at the willingness of the so-called free world to really follow in sync what the U.S. is leading? Is the U.S. able to rally these countries and, organize them in an opposition against China? And including Russia as well, because he was talking about there is an opportunity for Russia to be on the side of the United States.
Leadership is built on the justice. So nowadays, you cannot fool people because people can see clearly who they are and what is going on with the rest of the world. So right now, simply by fraudulent behavior, by painting a wrong picture of the reality, by demonizing China, I do not think that it is really there to rally the support to the United States. And the other is through bully. Yes, I would think that some states will yield or succumb to the bully, but that can only be a transient phenomenon, which is not really there to unite. So, by creating a lot of labels, raising a red alert, even, those smaller countries wouldn't really buy in that type of leadership. Okay. So now democracy, is something that, if you really stretch those, conceptual jargons, and you got to fill meaning with it, and you got to justify it with the reality.
Okay. My last question, Rick. People are asking whether this is a script that the next administration, whoever it might be, will be forced to follow, and that's why it's laid out here. And now, Rick, your take.
I do believe he wants, as he said, to draw a line in the sand that can't be erased if it's President Joe Biden or anyone else. But I think that the relationship with China will be reset come next January. I don't think it will go back to the way it was at all, but I do think that Joe Biden will think differently about U.S.-China relations and the place of the U.S. and China in the world.
Okay, definitely we hope that rationality will prevail, because right now it's upside down, seems to be a lot of people. Anyway, many thanks to Rick Dunham joining us from Washington, Washington D.C., and Professor Liu Baocheng joining us from Beijing. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. I hope we don't have to talk about such topics too often. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.